Hello, I'm Aresevé, and welcome to Major Dreams, Minor Thoughts, where music meets memory and history hums beneath every note. For those of you who are new to the podcast, Major Dreams, Minor Thoughts is a semi-autobiographical medium where we chronicle my journey in music. While converging on history and modern geopolitical affairs, we address and discuss the intersectionality of the global music economy, the racial and historical policies surrounding the genres, the creation and sometimes end of the people or places that created or inspired the genres, and the inevitable demise that often followed. This entry focuses on the history and founding of jazz and the blues. Coupled with black music as a means of protest against racial injustice and inequality, textbooks often omit how African Americans are responsible for creating the landscape of modern music, being the progenitors of gospel, the blues, and other American folk genres that would go on to spawn pop music, country, and rock and roll. Most of modern music can trace its roots to black Americans. With the horror that was the transatlantic slave trade came the global erasure of African history and culture. With this erasure came the disregard for the contributions of the black diaspora globally. Enslaved Africans were able to maintain their cultures by retrofitting them, alchemizing their cultures into concepts that could exist hidden in plain sight, preserving their cultures by combining it with European customs and traditions, which resulted in alterations and changes to the way many enslaved black Americans performed musical expression and prayer, according to the National Park Service. Slave owners' sole purpose and goal was to destroy the cultures and spirits of enslaved Africans. The songs that created modern music did not contain many of the recognizable elements that are widespread in the 21st century, with most early African American songs being relegated to field hollers. Field hollers contained the history of their people and culture. These songs contained the hope for salvation. Salvation not only for themselves, but also for their descendants, who they knew would have to bear and endure the horrors awaiting them in a foreign land. Part 1. Field Hollers, Work Songs, and Modern Music. Black folk music, which would later come to be known as the blues, emerged from the cane rows and levee camps of the rural South. The purpose of a levee is to hold water when a river floods during heavy rain or a storm surge. Levee camps provided labor for the construction and reinforcement of levees along the Mississippi River. Cane rows and levee camps were reminiscent of slavery, a place where exploitation was rampant. Black laborers were often subjected to brutal work hours, discriminatory pay, and widespread physical violence, coupled with the manufactured and near inescapable debt that they would never hope to pay off. Pop music and other genres had these levee camps and cane rows to thank for their creation. Nearly every genre finds its roots traced back to plantations, cane rows, and levee camps of the rural South in some way, shape, or form. These places of abject horror have the legacy of being the birthplace of modern music, with the most popular genres emerging from southern plantations being jazz. Jazz is often referred to as African American music, while simultaneously being called America's classical music. Jazz emerged to become the most popular music during the early 20th century during the Reconstruction era and Jim Crow. This was a time highlighted by mass inequity, widespread poverty, and the unlawful and mass lynching of black people, highlighted by a system of segregation marked by mass inequality for black people and other non-white groups. This system was referred to as the Jim Crow system, named for a performer who donned blackface to perform minstrel shows as a hyper-racialized version of black Americans. This system of exploitation, inequality, and widespread abuse inspired the civil rights movement, a movement that was mirrored by the music, pop culture, and style of the era, including jazz, which went on to become the soundtrack for the movement of freedom and equality. Jazz was born in African American communities in New Orleans, Louisiana, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. New Orleans was unique because of its geographical location and cultural atmosphere. New Orleans is geographically positioned at the base of the Mississippi River. This geographical positioning offers unique economic power because of the access to the Mississippi River, the Gulf of Mexico, and by extension, the Atlantic Ocean, three major bodies of water responsible for facilitating global trade. Culturally, New Orleans was unique because enslaved Black Americans in New Orleans were allowed to practice their culture with minimal penalty. This preservation of culture served as the perfect breeding ground for jazz to flourish. Jazz took its inspiration from the blues, African spirituals, West African Caribbean influence, and the music structure of European classical music. Much of jazz's musical grammar and essence can be traced to Africa, but the polyrhythm created within a short rhythmic cycle, blues notes, timbre, and improvisation of the call and response are uniquely Black American. Black American folk was established in the early 17th century. Black culture had the monumental task of enduring the transatlantic slave trade, American chattel slavery, the Civil War, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, and the Civil Rights Movement, following the pushback that followed it. The music that rose alongside the seemingly never-ending cycle of horror was the retelling of local history through lengthy ballads. A ballad is defined as either a song or a poem characterized by simple narrative structures. Many Black railroad workers and immigrants participated in the work song. The work song was a type of folk song utilized during labor to regulate work and engage one's attention when doing something monotonous. This was a continuation of the much older tradition of field hollers. Field hollers are rhythmically a loose vocal line that express lonesome individuality. The earliest example of the field holler is the Buzzard Lope, a spiritual song and dance with African origins. At death, enslaved Africans were often thrown into a field where their bodies were devoured by buzzards. For context, a buzzard is a medium to large bird of prey belonging to the same family and genus as hawk. In this dance, Black singers gathered in a circle, leaving a piece of cloth in the center to represent the deceased body. Individual singers would enter the ring, imitate a circling buzzard, and snatch the carry-on. This was a time marked by unimaginable cruelty. From this tradition came the foundation for genres like the blues, Negro spirituals, and folk music. The popularity and mainstream success of these genres followed the commercialization and exploitation of the Black artists who pioneered these genres and standards. White audiences became the largest consumers of Black music, particularly the blues. The blues, in essence, was and is a personal window into the singer's heart and mind. This vulnerability was unmistakable as well as captivating. Its defining characteristic was in being able to encompass human emotion in its rawest and most primal form. Because of the rampant exploitation and financial abuse, I consider this era the Great Black Commodification. An era defined by the constant production of Black talent coupled with no ownership, with an expressed emphasis on Black people acting out their roles as servants. White audiences not only wanted Black people raising their children, farming, and shining floors, but white America now wanted entertainment during it as well. Part 2. Wade in the water and run to the maroon swamps. The blues was described as a sobering metaphor for Black people contemplating the true meanings of freedom, according to Jazz Essential Listening. The earliest form of the blues borrowed its rhythmic flexibility from the field holler. Field hollers were a long-standing tradition of African music. They were performed by enslaved Black Americans working on plantations as a way of communication and for entertainment to combat the tedium of field work, according to Black Music Project. Enslaved Black Americans were not allowed to talk to one another while working in the field. Overseers saw it as a liability, fearing the enslaved were organizing and conspiring against their captors. But singing work songs or field hollers, however, was not prohibited. Field hollers and work songs were seen as non-threatening and unassuming. Enslaved Black Americans established communication networks that served as a secret code. White overseers interpreted the songs as being unintelligible gibberish. which was to the advantage of enslaved Black Americans, who were able to relay crucial information about times, dates, and locations related to their escape. Wade in the Water, a famous Negro spiritual, is one of the most famous examples of this ingenuity. The original context was a coded message because escaping wasn't the only challenge. When enslaved Black Americans escaped the plantations, they were often pursued by dogs. These dogs included mastiffs, the Fila Brasileira, and the various types of bloodhounds. These breeds were bred specifically for their ferocity, size, and ability to track, with their only function being the explicit purpose of hunting and tracking enslaved humans. Wade in the Water, perhaps one of the most popular field hollers, provided crucial information informing those seeking freedom to wade in the water after escaping. Rivers, streams, and swamps spread throughout the South were crucial in escape. The thick vegetation, muddy bogs, and deep water, the land was treacherous to navigate, and the strong smells created by swamps and bogs interfered with the dog's ability to track scent. For those who had no clear destination, communities were formed in remote swamps known as maroons. Maroons were self-governing societies formed by formerly enslaved Black people. The name comes from the Spanish word cimarron, which translates to wild or untamed. Such communities were established throughout remote parts of the Americas, most notably in the Caribbean and Brazil. These communities developed their own culture, government, trade, and military defense. Unique cultures developed because of the alliances formed with indigenous Native American people. The best example of this alliance can be found in Florida in the Black Seminole tribe, a community of Native Black Americans who escaped slavery in South Carolina and Georgia and formed alliances with the Seminole Nation in Florida. The Black Seminoles are a small offshoot of the Gullah who escaped from rice plantations. Gullah is defined as being Black American people who lived on the coast of South Carolina and nearby islands. Many communities were only possible because of the encrypted messages in field hollers and Negro spirituals. A solitary cry or a short, simple call and response delivering crucial warning and direction for freedom seekers to follow. Part 3. Blues and Jazz as a form of protest and exploitation of Black pioneers. The blues originates from these ancient African musical traditions, giving blues the reputation as being old as the hills. Blues, like many other genres created by Black Americans, became a medium of rebellion. The blues and jazz became the music of the Black American fight for freedom and equality. This music was a direct protest against the state-sanctioned violence that Black Americans experienced for hundreds of years. Despite jazz and many other genres being understood and classified as Black music, most of the executives behind the most prominent artists were white, a theme that has remained the standard even in modern era. The problem comes not from the prevalence of white executives, but when there is a systemic structure of exploitation surrounding Black artists driving these demographic expressions. Many Black artists would be approached by executives from major recording companies, and these artists would be charmed and coaxed into the most exploitative and egregious record deals imaginable. Record labels spent the early part of the 20th century gaining control of Black voices, publishing rights, and master royalties, as well as stealing music, singing, and playstyles from Black artists. Freddie Keppard was a jazz artist who famously refused the offer to become the first Black artist to make a commercial recording. He refused the offer because he had deep fears and anxieties surrounding having his music stolen. He worried that his unique style of cornet playing would be easy to copy if recorded, and with that his entire livelihood would be at risk. This fear and anxiety, coupled with widespread exploitation and abuse, would become the shared experience between many Black artists, often leading to mental health problems and long-term struggles with addiction. For Black artists, there weren't many coping mechanisms to deal with the industry and the world at large. many black pioneers of music would either overdose in relation to their substance abuse, die impoverished because of their predatory recording contracts that stripped away their artistic autonomy and music rights, or only find fame and notoriety after they were deceased, and couldn't reap the rewards from their newfound success. The legendary Ray Charles famously said, "I never wanted to be famous, I only wanted to be able to eat." For the few artists who realized what was being done, they stood to lose everything, fighting labels in court to get the rights to their music. Many famous black artists of the jazz age who pioneered the genre did not have the industry experience or the music business education to understand what was happening. Most of the most prolific jazz performers got their start playing music on roadsides, in bars, or nightclubs. Most of the legends we know were once poor, hungry, and extremely vulnerable individuals. They would be propositioned with a deal of a lifetime, being offered more money than they'd ever made from many of their small-time gigs, all in exchange for signing contracts with vernacular they couldn't even hope to understand. This lack of understanding wasn't for lack of trying. Many black people coming out of slavery and Reconstruction were not allowed to read, with many black and white people during the time being fundamentally illiterate. They would inadvertently sign away their voices, their likeness, their publishing, and their future royalties for a one-time sum of money that would be paid over the course of years. Many of these artists suffered with addiction, depression, and other mental, physical ailments, many of whom would die before they could even realize what had happened. Major record labels were allowed to grow and expand their reach over the course of the next century on the mountain of unpaid royalties, masters, and record sales of many black artists. This theme continued well into the modern era. These wealth inequities didn't stop at jazz or the entertainment industry. These were all symptoms of redlining, segregation, voter suppression, and unlawful pay discrepancies. These things culminated to create the perfect environment for not only black artists, but black people to end up at the bottom of the socioeconomic hierarchy. African Americans escaped the fields of slavery only to be led into the arms of poverty. With that poverty came the mass criminalization of it. This criminalization was woven into the very fabric of the amendment that served to free enslaved people. The 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution, ratified in 1865, abolished slavery and involuntary servitude, giving the impression of freeing black Americans from the bondage of slavery. Slavery and involuntary servitude were prohibited, except as a punishment for a crime for which the person shall have been duly convicted. Thus began the 100-year Plan B to criminalize blackness, poverty, and intellectualism. The blues and jazz was there to bear witness to it all, growing, rising, and changing with African Americans and through them. Part 4. Lady Sings the Blues. One of the most infamous historical accounts of blues as a form of protest involves Billie Holiday. Strange Fruit was written by Abel Meeropol in 1939. Abel Meeropol was a teacher, a poet, and a songwriter. He originally wrote Strange Fruit as a poem after witnessing a lynching for the first time on a postcard. Billie Holiday's rendition of Strange Fruit was released in 1959, earning Billie Holiday a spot on the FBN's radar. The FBN, Federal Bureau of Narcotics, founded in 1930 by the Department of Treasury to assume enforcement of the provisions of the Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914, according to the DEA Museum. The FBN would later be dismantled and converted into the DEA. The DEA stands for Drug Enforcement Administration after the FBN changed its focus to the specific domain of drug trafficking. Strange Fruit was originally written as a poem in protest of the horrifying brutality of lynchings and systemic racism after Meeropol had seen a photo of what a lynching actually looks like. A lynching is when a person, in this context, a black person, would be murdered, often by being hanged from a tree, in a public space as a means means of intimidation. White audiences could not get enough of this song, which encapsulated the horror of mass lynching campaigns targeting black people. Billie Holiday was targeted by the FBN in response to her touring and singing Strange Fruit across the country. Her touring resulted in a growing opposition to lynchings and racial-based discrimination of the Jim Crow South. Billie Holiday was just one of the many black artists and activists who were targeted, harassed, and misrepresented. Billie Holiday's primary crime was daring to speak out about the systemic racial abuse. Billie Holiday felt personally attacked by the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, FBN. Billie Holiday felt their focused targeting of her was deeply rooted in her race and political implications of her singing Strange Fruit. She believed the government was being vindictive and petty regarding her drug habits because of her airing out of the country's dirty laundry on record. Billie Holiday suffered from drug addiction because of her traumatic childhood and life. It was a well-known secret that most entertainers and performers engaged in illegal substances and drugs. The government and local law enforcement would turn a blind eye because of the money that would be generated by performers. But Holiday made the mistake of speaking out against racism, which by extension was speaking out against the government. Instead of focusing on a more rehabilitative and recovery-focused means of enforcement, the U.S. government and other agencies took a personal shining to Billie Holiday when she was doing what many artists of the time were doing. The U.S. government decided to make an example out of Billie Holiday. The aim was to make her the poster child for the war on narcotics, which would later become the full-blown war on drugs. Billie Holiday was quoted as saying, "I'm a Negro. I've got 2 strikes against me, and don't you forget it." Holiday was not only a black person, but a black woman who dared to protest lynching, which resulted in her lifelong targeting, even following her death. Part 5. Priced out of our handmade heaven. Despite jazz being intrinsically and forever linked to the Black American struggle for liberation, there has been a noticeable and drastic decrease in the prevalence of black people in mainstream jazz for decades. The great black commodification of black music brought many black artists to the forefront, for better or for worse. With this visibility came the eventual exploitation that follows anything created by or connected to black people. In 2025, Black Americans made up the highest poverty rates, closely followed by Hispanic Americans. These rates have been consistently influenced by policy and legislation that have indirectly and directly targeted non-white communities since Reconstruction. Following Trump's 2025 administration and the passing of aggressive and targeted executive acts, over 300,000 black women have left the American workforce. This can be attributed to massive federal job cuts, the dismantling of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, and politically motivated economic pressures that have destroyed many small businesses. With these visible and active attacks on non-white communities comes chronic stress and widespread poverty. With policy that targets the marginalized eventually follows the criminalization of it, which is seen more clearly in the Trump 2025 government shutdown, caused by Republican Trump-backed efforts to spike health care prices for over 40 million U.S. citizens. A shutdown that resulted in the cutting of SNAP benefits and a subsequent mass starvation across the country. With these factors in mind, we can identify that with poverty comes the inability to afford the expensive instruments, lessons, and the time it takes to create child prodigies. Many black and non-white children across America are being barred from the arts, often being influenced or told it's not realistic or valuable to society, or being told outright that they should pursue a career path that is more economically secure. Black Americans today are being unilaterally barred from higher education, which includes colleges and music programs. This is due in part to the inherent biases within the classical music world. The same biases that denied Nina Simone the ability to become a classical concert pianist despite her massive talent, coupled with continued racial bias and violence that affect black artists even when they do enter into these programs. Today, many programs that specialize in jazz and other genres of classical live music see an impressive lack of diversity, even in communities where black people make up the ethnic majority. with widespread cultural appropriation, marginalization, and the increased likelihood of black artists experiencing erasure or outright having their work stolen or interpreted by non-black people with bigger platforms. These factors all lead to the continued decline of black musicians in these spaces. Black artists are at a major disadvantage in trying to gain prominence, visibility, or notoriety in a genre that was specifically created and shaped by their personal struggles and hardships. This history and sentiment is echoed by the current political climate. The standard of suppressing black contributions to society and music at large, driven by the newfound anti-woke and anti-DEI movement. New waves of ideology that reflect the age-old American traditions that were present and at the root of oppression when field hollers, the blues, and jazz were first created. Despite the growing attempts to separate black Americans from the contributions to society and modern music, there is no separating the blues, jazz, and any genre from the longing of liberation associated with black Americans, because there is no rhythm without our blues. Thank you for listening to another entry of Major Dreams, Minor Thoughts. Until next time, have a good one. Sincerely, Aresevé.